Well, good morning again, and welcome again to some of our guests. I know that we have some believers group with us, and it's always good to see them each year. And hopefully I'll see some more of you during the week. That'd be awesome. I've struggled with, there was a title I really wanted to use this week, and then I couldn't use it because I changed my mind on something. So I've really struggled with the title this week. We'll call it Faith in Jesus. That sounds really boring to me. That's why I didn't like that title. It sounds boring. Faith in Jesus. We talk about that all the time. Let's just call it that, and we're gonna move on. We're in the book of Mark, for those of you who have not been with us, and we've gone from the beginning, and we're working our way through. We're still relatively early in Jesus' ministry. I don't know if you know the story of Mark or the story of Jesus' life. If you're unfamiliar, Jesus didn't start in Judea where the temple was. He didn't start in Jerusalem. That's not where he started. He started up in Galilee, which is a separate region from Judea. It's separated from, so Judea where the temple is and Jerusalem and all that is kind of down here. And then you have Samaria. Maybe you've heard of Samaria. And Galilee is actually a region above that. Jesus hasn't even left there. We're in chapter 5. He hasn't left Galilee. He has not made it to Judea. Galilee is where Jesus is from. Have you ever heard Jesus of Nazareth? Nazareth was in Galilee. This is his home place. This is his stomping grounds. This is where he's from. And so all the action that we've been doing so far has been there. And then, so down by Jerusalem, there's the Dead Sea. I don't know if you've ever heard of the Dead Sea. And then there's the River Jordan. And then at the top of the River Jordan, there's a lake. They call it the Sea of Galilee in the Bible. We would call it a lake. It's an inland lake. It's not enormous. It's fairly good size, but it's not. There are certainly lakes in the world that are far bigger. And Jesus has been teaching beside the lake, or this lake, the Sea of Galilee. Last week, he took this strange trip to the other side of the lake. He went as far across the lake as you could go. The lake is kind of oblong shaped, and he went from the top to the bottom for about a day to do some stuff with a guy that had a lot of demon problems, killed a whole bunch of pigs, and now he's come back. And that's kind of the setting of where we're at. So I'm going to read to you first the passage that we're in, Mark chapter 5. We're going to start in verse 21, and we're going to go to verse 34. I'm reading out of the New International Version. If you don't have a Bible, I heard a joke recently. Ladies and gentlemen, please turn your Bibles on. Which is becoming more and more common. If you don't have a Bible to turn on, there are some back there that you can actually flip through physically on the shelf. Okay. Mark chapter 5, verse 21 through 34. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue rulers, named Jairus, came there. Seeing Jesus, he fell at his feet and pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all that she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, "If I just touch his clothes, I will be healed." Immediately, her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. And he turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and, trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering. Let's pray one more time. Heavenly Father, as we go to your word this morning, we pray that it would be open to us. We invite the Holy Spirit to be part of our understanding, that we would have our hearts illuminated by your Spirit, because we cannot understand the heart and the mind of God without the Spirit of God doing that illumination. Amen. So Lord, would you be in our midst right now as we seek to understand what we're reading? And Lord, would it pierce more than our brains? Would it impact who we are, how we live, what we do, that we would be better disciples when we leave than when we came? In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Okay. First of all, there's two different things happening here very close together. I wanted desperately to do both of them, and I just couldn't fit them both. So they're not together. You're going to have to come back next week for the other part. So there's a man whose daughter is dying. And there's a woman who has a bleeding problem. They don't know each other. They're not involved with each other. Their stories come from totally different places. And yet, they impact Jesus at roughly the exact same moment. They're entangled. Both events will add some new depth to our understanding of Jesus. And in fact, this is a pattern we're going to be looking for. For those of us who are continuing to work through Mark with me, last week I challenged you. I said, look, we've seen some things about Jesus so far. We already know that he can heal people. We already know that he can cast out demons. We already know that he's calling disciples. So we have some events. Then last week, some new stuff happened. It was different. It had elements that were the same, but then there were different things. As Mark continues to build, we need to understand he isn't just giving us more and more and more of exactly the same. He could have done that, and then we would have just kind of had, reinforcement. Yes, Jesus can heal. Oh, yes, Jesus can heal. Oh, yes, Jesus can still heal. But that's not what's happening. As Mark introduces event after event after event, he introduces new complexities. He puts new bits in. And for us to grow in understanding of who Jesus is, which is what Mark wants us to do as we're reading this book, we start with this little understanding of Jesus, and then it grows, so that by the end we have a perfect and wonderful view of Jesus. For that to happen, we've got to notice what's different. So one of the challenges we're going to have as we go is to notice what in this story is different or added or new from before. So that's one of the things that we need to look at as we go. And by the way, a way that I would challenge you to read the Bible, whenever you read the Bible, you should read it in order and try to understand the purpose of the author as you work. So Mark has already introduced us to Christ and the disciples and some of the basic principles of the kingdom of God, and those things have already happened. So we're going to look for what's different this time, like I said. What we're going to do, and it's going to take quite some time, in fact, the bulk of this particular sermon is actually just going over the action. This story is complex. It's quite long, and it's got a lot of pieces, and we're going to spend quite a long time just kind of pulling the story apart and figuring it out. So that's what we're going to spend the majority of the time doing. It might have been a while for those of you who have been listening, and for those of you who haven't been part of our continuing story. Jesus has been teaching near a town named Capernaum. That's where all the original stuff happened. In fact, Jesus has a house in Capernaum. Peter has a house in Capernaum. Peter was in the house in Capernaum when Jesus came and healed Peter's mom. And the place that Jesus has been teaching by the Sea of Galilee is near Capernaum. It's up in Galilee. Our first sermon was on the authority of Christ that took place in the synagogue of Capernaum. That's Jesus' home church. That would be Jesus' church. Like, this is our church. He's did a lot of traveling, but in all that time, before that, and some of that time before that, this is where Jesus went to church. He would know the people that were there. So in verse 22, there's some things that we need to remember. So in verse 21, we have Jesus crossed again over to the other side of the lake. So he's back where he started. And guess what? We're looking at about a 24-hour period, really. There was a huge crowd. Jesus left, did his thing, came back. It hasn't been that long. The crowd of thousands has not disappeared in 24 hours. They're still there. So he comes back to the massive crowd. They're there again. But waiting with this massive crowd is someone Jesus definitely knows. One of the synagogue rulers named Jairus comes there. If he was a synagogue ruler or magistrate or a person in charge, and this was Jesus' church, Jesus would have known this guy. In fact, he would have known the daughter. Capernaum isn't this massive metropolis city. It's a little town kind of like Exmouth. This is the person Jesus knows. This is people in his life. And we find out in verse 23 his problem. My little daughter is dying. Let's just stop there. My little daughter is dying. Please do not read those words without letting it get in here. Every parent in this room, I want you to feel my child is dying right now. You cannot understand some of the focus and the underlying tension of this entire story if you don't understand that there's a person in this group that's like, no, Jesus, you don't understand, my daughter's dying right now. If you don't understand that, you're going to miss some of the tension in this story. If your kid is next to you and they are bleeding out, and you're driving to the hospital and an emu comes into the middle of the road, wanders over, what's happening to that emu? You're driving right over it. You wouldn't normally drive over it. But if your daughter's dying, you're going around or you're going through or you're doing something, you're going to get to that hospital. Why? Your kid is dying and you need to get to the hospital. There is an urgency that comes with our kids in danger, is there not? A pretty serious urgency. I'm trying to imagine Jairus, his daughter's sick, and then he runs, right? He runs to the Sea of Galilee because Jesus has been teaching there. Everyone knows he's been teaching there. There's thousands of people there. And he shows up and he's like, where's Jesus? Well, we don't know. He left. Well, where'd he go? Well, we don't know. He's frantic and he's pacing. He's waiting. Where is he? And then here comes Jesus on the boat. And the boats are coming in and they're crawling, right? It's like barely moving. So on. And as soon as Jesus gets off that boat, he is on it. Jesus, you got to come down. What is he envisioning? He's envisioning he and Jesus running, right? Running for the house. That's how it happens. It says, so Jesus went with him, and a large crowd followed and pressed around him. How fast do you think he was moving? Have you ever done the large crowd shuffle? You know? You're out there and you're moving like this. Because there's so many people that you can't move. His daughter's dying and they're doing the large crowd shuffle across all the way to Capernaum. This guy had to be pulling his hair out. The large crowd followed and pressed around him. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. And here's where we get a whole different plot impacting the story from the side. Now, a few things. This word bleeding, she definitely had a menstrual bleeding problem. Okay? That's what this is. We're talking about menstrual bleeding for 12 years. And as much as any woman in this world has already gone, oh, that just sounds so horrible. It's way worse if you're Jewish. So much worse. So much incredibly worse. And to understand this, we're going to have to take a little trip. We're going to take a trip back to Leviticus chapter 15. I know I'm making you flip pages, but this is pretty important. Is it 15? Hold on. I got lost in my notes.
1519.
Pardon?
1519.
1519. I had it right, I just couldn't find it. 1519. There we go. Sorry about that. Here we go. This is what it means when you're a Jew. When a woman has a regular flow of blood, the impurity of her monthly period will last 7 days, and anyone who touches her will be unclean until evening. Anything she lies on during that period will be unclean, and anything she sits on will be unclean. And whoever touches her bed must wash their clothes and bathe with water, and they will be unclean till evening. Whoever touches anything she sits on must wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he will be unclean till evening. Whether it is the bed or anything she was sitting on, whenever anyone touches it, they will be unclean until evening. If a man lies with her and her monthly flow touches him, he will be unclean for 7 days. Any bed he lies on will be unclean. When a woman has a discharge of blood for many days at a time, other than her monthly period, that would be this woman's exact situation. Okay? It's in here. Her situation is in Leviticus. Whereas a discharge that continues beyond her period, she will be unclean as long as she has the discharge, just as in the days of her period. Any bed she lies on while her discharge continues will be unclean, as is her bed during her monthly period. Anything she sits on will be unclean, as in during her period. Whoever touches them will be unclean. He must wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he will be unclean until evening. She has lived with that for 12 years. She has not been able to go into the temple and worship for 12 years. She's not been able to sacrifice for her sins or for any of the things that happened or for any of the things that she's supposed to do. She has not been able to participate in any of the festivals during the year for 12 years. She has been an outcast and unable to communicate and deal with her society for a very long time. She is unclean. She is destroyed. This is not a minor issue any way you look at it. I researched the causes medically that could do this sort of thing. None of them are very pleasant. There's a fair amount of pain with most of them, which means she's probably been in pain for a very long time. She spent all she had on doctors and got worse. And that's no surprise, because from what I've found, it's difficult to diagnose and treat today. Often just ending up in a full hysterectomy, which they were completely, of course, incapable of doing. By the way, she had money. You know why we know she had money. She could afford a doctor. Look, most people didn't get to do that. Most people couldn't afford doctors. They just got sick. She could afford doctors. She had watched a significant financial amount because she had hired doctors. And she had watched it all drain out. And she had spent everything she had. She had gone from affluent and important and respected and wealthy to dirt poor with nothing, ostracized and out of her own community. That's the story of this woman. There's a warning, though, at the end of that Leviticus 15 passage. It's a weird one. Leviticus 15, 19 through 32. And I stopped at the end, but here's what I want you to read about it. Verse Leviticus 15, 31 and 32. If you aren't there, just listen. You must keep the Israelites separate from things that make them unclean. Listen to this part. So they will not die in their uncleanness for defiling my dwelling place which is among them. Now, however you might read that warning, no matter what you might think, here's what I think. I think that woman knew about that warning and was terrified of dying in her uncleanness. She was terrified about what that would mean to her eternal destiny. She was terrified. What happens to me if I die unclean? What does that mean about my relationship with my God? What does that mean about my eternal future? What does that mean? I think she was scared to death. I think she was scared to death for more than just her physical well-being. I think she was scared to death about her eternal place. Because Leviticus said, don't die in your uncleanness, it's bad. And that's more than enough to make the imagination just go, what happens to me? What happens to me if I die this way? This was a desperate woman in every possible way you can imagine being desperate. She was desperate financially, she was desperate physically, she was desperate socially, and she was desperate spiritually. She was broken. By the way, what she's doing right now is totally against the rules. She's not supposed to touch people. How dense is the crowd? How many people will she have to touch on her way to Jesus? And make them unclean. Do you think she's doing this? Oh, sorry. By the way, I'm unclean, so you're unclean till evening. You're going to need to wash, okay? Do you think she's doing that with each person she's touching? No. The question of what happens when you die unclean, what happens to my soul? Is that a thought that's ever terrorized you? What's going to happen to my soul? If you've ever felt that question, if you've ever worried about what's going to happen to me, then you understand how this woman feels. So what's her plan? Well, in verse 27, we find out what it is. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. What is she not supposed to be doing? Touching people. Because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, oh, she's justified it, I will be healed. I won't actually be touching him. I'll touch his clothes. Now she knows that that's still too much, but it's enough. I didn't touch him, but touch his clothes. That's her plan. The other two accounts in Matthew and Luke specify that it was the hem of his garment, and there's some amazing things to talk about with that. The hem of his garment had tassels because he was a rabbi, and those tassels signified his authority. And so there's also an aspect here of that she was reaching out for that authority that she knew that he had spiritually. That isn't the account we have in Mark, but that is a very interesting and powerful analogy also. But what's crazy in verse 29 is that it works. See, that's what's beyond reckoning. That's what's beyond imagining. That's what's beyond any kind of thinking. It works. Whatever was wrong, let me tell you what, it didn't feel right. We know it didn't feel right because as soon as it got fixed, she felt different. She felt better. She knew. Whatever that pressure was, or the ick, or the cramps, or the whatever, they were gone. They were immediately and obviously gone. This woman had to have been so happy. I mean, look, she could go to the temple in 7 days. She could sacrifice the 2 doves. No one had to know her embarrassing situation of how she had just violated their spiritual rights by spreading her uncleanliness everywhere. This would be her little secret. She'd get to the temple, she'd get clean, and she could go home. That's her plan. So right now, she's pretty happy. Jairus is okay happy. Jesus is at least still making progress in the right direction. Not nearly fast enough, but at least he's going that way. Right? So the woman is deliriously happy, Jairus is sort of happy, and they're moving. And then Jesus makes everybody unhappy. Everyone is about to get unhappy because he stops. He stops and turns around and he quits moving. Jairus is now furious. You're not moving towards my daughter. She is dying. What are you stopping for? The woman is terrified. Did you know? How did you know? How do you know I just touched your garment and there's people all around you. How did you know? She's terrified. That's verse 30. At once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him, and he turned around in the crowd and asked, who touched my clothes? And he stops. And the whole world explodes. And here's his disciples. You see the people crowding against you? His disciples answered, and yet you can ask, who touched me? Here's their question. That is the most ridiculous question, Jesus, you have asked yet. What are you talking about? People have been touching you the whole time. And now you're saying, who touched you? What's a stupid question like that? How are we going to answer that? And of course, Jesus is asking who touched me. So all the disciples are like, oh, he's asked us to do another silly thing. How are we going to figure out who touched him? How we got another dumb job? Got to figure out who touched him. Yeah. But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Now here's what I imagine. This is just an imagining, okay? But I'm trying to put myself in the place of this woman that touched his garment. I'm trying to deal with the sense of guilt and shame that she already has, that she's in this crowd, that she's been touching people all morning, and that she just touched this rabbi, right? So Jesus says, who touched me? What is the rest of the sentence that's going through her mind? Who touched me and made me unclean? Don't you think that's the panic going through her heart? I can't prove that. But I know she's terrified. Why would she be terrified? She'd be terrified because of guilt and shame and feeling like she'd done something wrong and fearing that she was about to get chewed out. That's what she's worried about. Who touched me and uncleaned me? Is what she's worrying, I think. Of course, we know that Jesus can be made unclean. If you want to learn about that, go back to the story of the leper. Jesus is unclean proof. That doesn't happen. But she doesn't know that. Guilt, horrible guilt, is flooding her heart. This powerful man of God knows my secret. He knows what I have done. I have defiled him, and I didn't even tell him. Because that would be the truth of her reality. I touched him and I defiled him. He's going to go try to save this girl. Maybe he won't even be able to do that. He's unclean now. Now he can't touch the girl. He has to be unclean until nightfall. There's a whole cascade of thoughts going through her head. And like I said, meanwhile, Jairus is losing his mind. My daughter is dying, and you stopped to ask who touched my clothes. What are you doing? Verse 31. His disciples were lost. Verse 32. But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it, and then he saw the woman. The woman, knowing what had happened, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, she told him the whole truth. What do her actions and her posture indicate? They indicate that she may be physically healed, but emotionally, relationally, spiritually, she is still broken. This is not leaping and rejoicing and praising God. Isn't that what we normally see when someone's healed, right? Jesus heals the lame man, and he's like, woohoo! Or he heals a blind person or a deaf person, they go tell everybody. This one wants to escape. And they're saying sorry, they're apologizing. They've been healed and they're apologizing. She's broken. This is doubt and fear and guilt and shame. And then Jesus says a sentence absolutely packed with meaning and power. I mean, so packed, it's just incredible. This sentence has so much in it. He says, first, daughter. Do you see what he just established there? There's so much. Jesus has already talked about that the first stage of discipleship is family. The first, most foundational aspect of what it means to be my disciple is that you be family with me. He just established that with her in one word. He said, you're my daughter. He said, daughter. And he established your family. Bang. And he just accounted to her all the value and all the worth of what? Of Jairus, who's madly desperate to save his daughter. And now this woman has all that same value, all that same worth, all that same care, all that same protectiveness. Jesus is saying in that one word, you're worth to me what Jairus' daughter is worth to her. Of course I would stop for you. I love you. You're my daughter. Wow. Then he says, your faith has healed you. This is a new bit. And I've been doing some study. It's a fairly unique bit. You know, we've had circumstances so far where a person had faith, right? But then Jesus said something or touched them. Later he's going to spit. He's going to spit a lot in Mark. Mark is a spitting book. A lot of saliva in Mark. Anyway, Jesus does stuff. Right? So someone has faith, and Jesus hears from God, and Jesus does something. This time, something weird happens. Jesus is walking. He isn't doing anything. The woman has faith, and in her faith, she acts. And in the will of God, he still accounts that, and he gives her the miracle, and Jesus didn't do anything. That's weird. I don't even know exactly how to explain that. But that's what happens. But I would tell you that she was only healed of her physical affliction. Let me see if I can't explain that to you. I'm going to get picky about words here, so bear with me. And if you get bored being picky about words, I'm sorry, but just try to go with me because this one's important. Sometimes you have to be picky about words. All right? I'm going to talk about tenses. So here's the first phrase. Your faith has healed you, right? Has. Has means in the past. It already happened. Your faith has healed you in the past. Then what does he say next? Go in peace. That's present tense, right? Go. That's present tense. Now, he says something about her suffering. Other versions say affliction or even plague. So this is a word that has some various English translations to it, right? What tense of the verb is associated with being freed from the suffering? Be. Present tense again. See, if he was going to talk proper English, if it was good grammar, and he was still talking about a physical affliction, this is the way this would read. It would read like this. Your faith has healed you. Go in peace. You have been freed from your suffering. You following me? That would be correct grammar. Correct grammar, if he's talking about that she was healed, would be that. I'm going to say it again. It would read like this. Your faith has healed you. Go in peace. You have been freed from your suffering. But Jesus is freeing her from something else. This is a second stage of freedom. This is another affliction, another suffering, another plague. It's the plague of her fear and doubt and pain and spiritual brokenness and her shame and her guilt. That's suffering. Because she was clearly not over that part. That's why she was groveling at his feet. See, her faith did in fact heal her. But her faith did not restore her relationship with God. Jesus' proclamation restored her to God and her faith. Jesus proclaimed that she was freed from her suffering. So, Jesus paused on the way to saving one daughter from physical death to save another daughter from spiritual death. And what I wanted to name this, if I could manage to have crammed all of it in one sermon, would have been A Tale of Two Daughters. Don't think for a moment that this woman was any less valuable to Jesus than Jairus' daughter was. So what's our takeaway? And how does this very intense story have anything to do with us? I would suggest to you that today, on a Sunday, starting now, and as the sun goes across the planet, people worship later. We're doing it early in the global day. Millions and millions of people are going to crowd around Jesus. They're going to bump up against him. They're going to sing about him. They're going to talk about him. They'll probably learn about him from a Bible. They're going to hear about him. They might learn more in their brain about who he is. They'll crowd him. Relatively few will touch him. Relatively few will have an encounter with Jesus today that changes who they are. That they actually are impacted by the power of Jesus in their life. The brain might get bigger and they might have a good time and they might be encouraged. Do you want to be one of those people that actually touches Jesus today? Because what is required to be there? And I guess my first question is for you is, how desperate are you? How desperate are you to get in contact with Jesus? How desperate are you to be with him? How desperate are you for him to impact who you are, for him to release you from your guilt and your shame and your mess and your yuck? How desperate are you? I think there's some desperate people here. This woman was desperate. You know what? In her desperation, she didn't do everything perfect. Her actions either, depending on your viewpoint, either flat out broke the law or definitely dishonored the intent of it. She was not saved by her ability to keep the rules. She was breaking them right now. She was breaking them. She was in her sin. She was walking in her sin. She was breaking the law even now. She was breaking it. But her faith was in Jesus. The object of her faith meant so much more than the level of her perfection. In fact, the level of her perfection meant nothing. The faith and her object of her faith meant everything. That was the difference between her and all the thousands of people shuffling around in an amoeba towards Jairus' house. The rest of them were around Jesus. They wanted to see Jesus do cool stuff. They couldn't wait for the next show. He was going to heal someone else. This is going to be really cool. Let's all go watch. And they had a spectator, watcher, go see what the show is like mentality about Jesus. One person wanted Jesus to change them, and they couldn't care less what had happened to anybody else. They were desperate for Jesus for me right now. I don't even know how big her faith was. It was big enough that she thought if only I could touch his clothes, it would be enough. It's pretty big faith. Where's your faith? Not how much or why, where. Putting it in me or a church or a Bible study or a program or even a denomination is not going to help you. If you want to touch Jesus like she touched Jesus, your faith must be in him and him alone. And if your faith is in yourself, well, then you are a long, long way off. Because you got nothing. If a person could manage to fix themselves, this woman had spent every resource she had to try to fix herself. It wasn't enough. And really, I'm just going to be honest, this question doesn't change much whether you would describe yourself as a Christian or not. No matter what changes or miracles or whatever it is you've seen in your life, if Jesus hasn't pronounced you a son or a daughter of the King, your true problem still exists. Your guilt and shame are still your enemy weighing you down. And if you're a Christian, we still need that reconnection with Christ. We can wander from it so far. We can allow it to become something that we remember fondly, or maybe we've even forgotten, but we've got to get back to the place where we're simply touching Jesus and allowing his power to transform us. This is one of the reasons why, to me, worship and communion and the other things that we do on a Sunday morning are in so many ways more important than what I'm doing right now. Because what I'm doing right now, few people are going to touch Jesus now. When are we personally, actively involved in worship and in reaching out to Christ? That's in worship. So if you come here and you think that all you get is from what I say, you're missing the part where you're active. You're missing the part where you can pour out your heart. You're missing the part where you're reaching out to him and you're experiencing his presence and you're actively involved. And then communion and worship and the other things we do, that's when you are involved. You can't touch Jesus sitting and listening to me talk. You have to touch Jesus actively. You must do it. You have to do it somehow. In a prayer, in a song, in a moment, in a kneeling at the front, in some sort of submission, in something you have to do it. I can't do it, and you can't have it happen by listening to me in a seat. So as we sing this last song, the invitation is simply this. Don't just sing. In fact, don't even sing if that gets in the way. In your desperation, reach out to Jesus yourself. Reach out for that connection. Reach out for that power. Reach out for that assurance. And I'm not promising you that all the physical ailments will drop off. And I'm not promising you that your world will suddenly get easy. But I will promise you that if you connect with Jesus, his power will do something in your life that is unforgettable and meaningful and change you and empower you and make it bearable and make you have joy even in bad circumstances. So as the musicians come up, I'm inviting you to, whether it's in what you sing or whether you don't sing at all, reach out to Jesus.